7. Innocent or immoral? A few days later, Winterbourne went to see Mrs. Miller at her hotel, hoping to persuade her to take better care of her daughter.
"I'm sorry Daisy isn't here,"
said Mrs. Miller.
"She's gone somewhere with Mr. Giovanelli. She's always going somewhere with Mr. Giovanelli."
"I've noticed that they're very intimate,"
said Winterbourne.
"Oh, it seems as if they couldn't live without each other,"
said Mrs. Miller.
"Well, at least he's a real gentleman. I keep telling Daisy that she's engaged."
"And what does Daisy say?"
"Oh, she says she isn't engaged, but she acts as if she is. I asked Mr. Giovanelli to tell me if they get engaged, so that I can write and tell Mr. Miller."
Winterbourne had never heard a parent speak of a daughter's behavior in such a distant way. He found Mrs. Miller's attitude so strange and confusing that he gave up the idea of warning her. After that, Winterbourne noticed that Daisy was no longer invited to people's houses. Society had decided that Miss Daisy Miller had gone too far. How did she feel about that? Sometimes he thought she did not care. She was too childish and superficial to notice what people thought of her. At other moments he thought she knew perfectly well the impression she produced, but she refused to change because she knew that she was innocent. But then he thought perhaps she refused to change because she was irresponsible. It was becoming more and more difficult for him to believe in her innocence. He was angry with himself because he could not decide what kind of young lady Miss Daisy Miller was. He had no idea whether her eccentricities were personal or national. By not inviting her to their parties, the other American residents in Rome were sending a clear message to their Italian friends, who were all aristocrats. They were telling the Italians that, though Miss Daisy Miller was an American young lady, she was not typical. So perhaps Daisy's eccentricities were purely personal. But was she innocent or immoral? Did she understand the consequences of her actions? Or was she ignorant of them? Was she simply a child? Or was she a rebellious young woman? One day he met her in the palace of the Caesars. She was walking through the flowers in the beautiful deserted gardens with Mr. Giovanelli.
"Aren't you lonely?"
asked Daisy.
"Lonely?"
"Yes. You're always walking around alone. Can't you find anyone to walk with you?"
"I'm not as fortunate as your companion,"
replied Winterbourne. From the first, Giovanelli had treated Winterbourne with great courtesy and respect. He had listened to Winterbourne's conversation and laughed whenever Winterbourne said something amusing. He gave the impression that he considered Winterbourne a superior young man. He did not act like a jealous lover. Obviously, Giovanelli was very diplomatic. He did not mind showing a little humility in front of the American. At times, it even seemed to Winterbourne that Giovanelli wanted to talk to him privately, to explain that of course he, Giovanelli, knew that this young lady was too good for him. On this occasion, he walked away from his companions and went to pick some flowers for his buttonhole.
"I know why you say that,"
said Daisy.
"You think I spend too much time with Mr. Giovanelli."
"Everyone thinks so."
"They don't really care what I do,"
Daisy replied.
"Oh, yes, they do. And they'll be very unpleasant to you. They're already being unpleasant to you. Haven't you noticed?"
"I've noticed you,"
said Daisy.
"but I noticed that you were very stiff and conventional the first time I saw you."
"I'm not as stiff as some of the others,"
said Winterbourne, smiling.
"Haven't you noticed that they don't invite you to their houses anymore?"
"Why do you let people be so unkind?"
cried Daisy.
"What can I do?"
replied Winterbourne.
"You could say something to them."
"I do say something. I say that your mother thinks you're engaged."
"Well, she does,"
said Daisy very simply.
"And does Randolph believe it?"
asked Winterbourne, laughing.
I don't know. I don't think he believes anything.
She replied.
And since you've mentioned it, I am engaged.
Winterbourne stopped laughing and looked at her in surprise.
You don't believe it,
cried Daisy. He was silent a moment and then said,
Yes, I believe it.
Oh, no, you don't.
She replied.
Well, then, I'm not.
Chapter 8. A Night at the Colosseum. A week later, Winterbourne was walking home alone at 11 o'clock at night after dinner with friends. He decided to go into the Colosseum. Outside, he noticed a carriage was waiting. He walked into the silent arena in the moonlight. One half of the gigantic circus was in shadow. The place had never seemed more splendid, and he remembered Byron's famous lines. But then he thought,
The poets love the Colosseum by night, but the doctors say it's dangerous because of the risk of getting malaria. I should go soon.
As he walked towards the great cross in the center of the arena, he saw that two people were on the steps at its base. One, a woman, was sitting on a step. Her companion was standing beside her. Then Winterbourne heard the woman's voice.
He looks at us as one of those old lions must have looked at the Christians.
It was the voice of Miss Daisy Miller. Let's hope he's not very hungry, Giovanelli replied with a laugh. Winterbourne stopped. He felt a combination of horror and relief. Now at last he knew what to think of Miss Daisy Miller. She was not a respectable young lady. He felt angry with himself for having spent so much time trying to decide what to think of her. He turned to walk out of the Colosseum, but then she spoke again.
It's Mr. Winterbourne. He saw me, and he didn't say hello.
How cleverly she played the part of the innocent. But he could not just ignore her. As he walked towards the great cross, Daisy stood up, and Giovanelli raised his hat. Winterbourne now began to think how crazy she was to be there. A delicate young girl should not spend the evening in the Colosseum. She might get Roman fever.
It's now clear,
thought Winterbourne,
that she's an immoral young woman. But even so, I don't want her to die of malaria. How long have you been here?
He asked angrily. Daisy, lovely in the moonlight, looked at him for a moment, then said gently,
We've been here all evening. Isn't it pretty?
You could get malaria. You won't think that's pretty,
cried Winterbourne. Then turning to Giovanelli, he said,
You're a Roman. You know about Roman fever. Why did you bring her here?
Ah, said the handsome Roman, I'm not afraid of getting malaria myself.
But what about this young lady?
I told the signorina that it was dangerous, but she's never cautious,
I've never been ill a day in my life,
said Daisy.
I wanted to see the Colosseum by moonlight, and we've had a lovely time. When I get home, Eugenio will give me some of his medicine against malaria. He has some splendid pills.
Well, go home now and take one,
cried Winterbourne. Giovanelli went out to find the carriage. Daisy followed with Winterbourne. She did not seem at all embarrassed. She talked about the beauty of the place and how glad she was to have seen it by moonlight. Then she noticed that Winterbourne was silent.
Why are you so quiet?
She asked. Winterbourne did not reply, but began to laugh.
Did you believe that I was engaged the other day?
She asked.
It doesn't matter what I believed the other day,
replied Winterbourne, still laughing.
Now I believe it makes very little difference whether you're engaged or not.
Daisy looked at him, but in the darkness he could not see her face. Then Giovanelli came to say that the carriage was ready.
Don't forget to take Eugenio's pills,
said Winterbourne. Daisy replied in a trembling voice.
I don't care whether I get Roman fever or not.
Then she got into the carriage, and it drove off. Chapter 9. Daisy becomes ill. Winterbourne told no one that he had met Miss Miller at 11 o'clock in the Colosseum with a gentleman. Nevertheless, 2 days later, all the American residents in Rome knew about it, and were talking about the little American flirt. Winterbourne found that he no longer cared that people were saying unkind things about Daisy Miller. Then he heard that Daisy was very ill. He went to the hotel to ask how she was. There he met 3 other visitors who said that Daisy was dangerously ill. She had a terrible case of malaria. He did not see Mrs. Miller. Finally, that lady was where she should always have been, at her daughter's side. Winterbourne went to the hotel often to ask for news of Daisy. One time he saw Mrs. Miller.
Daisy spoke of you the other day,
said Daisy's mother.
Half the time she's delirious from the fever, and she doesn't know what she's saying, but that time I think she did. She told me to tell you that she was never engaged to that handsome Italian. I was very glad to hear that. Mr. Giovanelli hasn't been to see us since she got ill. A lady told me that he's afraid that I'm angry with him for taking Daisy out at night. Well, I am angry with him, but I'm a lady. Even when I'm angry, I can be polite to guests. Anyway, Daisy said she's not engaged. I don't know why she wanted you to know. She told me 3 times, "Be sure to tell Mr. Winterbourne," she said. And then she told me to ask if you remember the time you went to that castle in Switzerland.
A week later, the poor girl died. Daisy's grave was in the little Protestant cemetery by the wall of Imperial Rome, beneath the cypress trees and the spring flowers. Winterbourne was surprised by the number of people present at the funeral. Many people who had been unkind to her when she was alive came to pay their last respects now that she was dead. Giovanelli stood near Winterbourne. He was very pale. On this occasion, he had no flower in his buttonhole. When the funeral was over, Giovanelli turned to Winterbourne and said, "She was the most beautiful young lady I ever saw, and the nicest." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "And she was the most innocent." Winterbourne looked at him, then repeated his words.
And the most innocent?
The most innocent. Winterbourne felt very angry.
Why the devil,
he asked,
did you take her to that fatal place?
Mr. Giovanelli was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I had no fear for myself, and she wanted to go."
"That's no reason,"
cried Winterbourne. Giovanelli was silent again, and then he said, "She didn't want to marry me. For a while I hoped, but now I'm sure that she didn't want to." Winterbourne listened to him. He looked down at the new grave surrounded by April flowers. When he looked up again, Mr. Giovanelli had gone. Winterbourne left Rome soon afterwards. In the months that followed, he often thought about Daisy Miller and her mysterious manners. The following summer he went to see his aunt, Mrs. Costello, in Vevey. One day he spoke to her about Daisy.
"I think I treated her unfairly,"
he said.
"She sent me a message before her death, which I didn't understand at the time. But I have thought about it since, and now I understand she wanted me to respect her."
Is that a modest way of saying she wanted you to love her?
Asked Mrs. Costello. Winterbourne did not reply to this question. After a short silence, he continued,
"What you said last summer was true. I did make a great mistake. I've lived too long in foreign countries."
Nevertheless, he went back to Geneva. His friends say that he is studying there. Other people say that he is interested in a very clever foreign lady.